In 1202, 30,000 crusaders were supposed to sail from Venice to liberate Jerusalem. Instead, they found themselves trapped on a Venetian island, unable to pay for their ships, surrounded by the most powerful navy in Europe. What happened next was the greatest heist in medieval history. Venice didn't just collect a debt. They turned an entire crusading army into their personal mercenaries, redirected a holy war to destroy their Christian rivals, and ended up stealing so much gold from Constantinople that they literally built a church out of it. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land. It never fought a single Muslim. Instead, it destroyed the greatest Christian city on earth, all because of a shipping contract written by a blind 90-year-old Venetian who played 4D chess while everyone else was playing checkers. This is the story of how Venice turned a holy war into a hostile takeover, how a debt for ships became the excuse to loot Constantinople's treasures, and how 4 bronze horses ended up traveling 1,500 miles from a Byzantine hippodrome to stand on St. Mark's Basilica, where they remain today, the ultimate monument to the greatest bait-and-switch in military history. Let me set the stage. It's 1198. Pope Innocent III has just called for a new crusade, the Fourth. Jerusalem had been reconquered by Saladin, and Christian Europe was burning to take it back. This was supposed to be the crusade that succeeded where the Third Crusade failed. Kings and nobles across Europe took the cross, promising to liberate the Holy Land or die trying. But here's the first problem. How do you get 30,000 medieval soldiers across the Mediterranean? The overland route through Anatolia was a death trap. The Second Crusade had tried that and got slaughtered. The only viable option was by sea. And in 1200, if you wanted to move an army by sea, there was only one power that could do it: Venice. Venice wasn't like other medieval states. It had no knights, no feudal lords, no agricultural base. It was a city of merchants built on wooden pilings in a lagoon, and its entire existence depended on trade. By 1200, Venice had the largest merchant fleet in Europe, the most sophisticated shipbuilding industry, and a near monopoly on trade with the East. If you wanted ships, you came to Venice. If Venice didn't like you, you walked. Enter the Crusade leaders. In 1201, 6 French nobles arrived in Venice to negotiate transport. They needed ships for 33 to 500 men, 4,500 knights with horses, 9,000 squires, and 20,000 foot soldiers. They needed provisions for a year. They needed the most massive naval operation in medieval history. The Venetians said yes, but the price was astronomical: 85,000 silver marks. To put that in perspective, the entire annual revenue of the Kingdom of England was about 20,000 marks. Venice was asking for 4 years of England's royal income just for transportation. It was 19.5 tons of silver. In modern terms, accounting for the relative value of silver in the medieval economy, we're talking about the equivalent of several $billion. But here's where the Venetians showed their genius. The contract, negotiated by Doge Enrico Dandolo himself, had several poison pills. First, the price was fixed regardless of how many crusaders actually showed up. If 33,000 came, it was 85,000 marks. If 10,000 came, it was still 85,000 marks. Second, payment was due in full when the fleet was ready, before anyone sailed anywhere. Third, Venice would halt all its commercial shipping for a year to build this fleet, so they needed guaranteed payment or their economy would collapse. The Crusader envoys, desperate to get their army moving, agreed to everything. They signed the Treaty of Venice in April 1201, probably not realizing they'd just signed their crusade's death warrant. Now let's talk about the puppet master behind all of this: Enrico Dandolo, Doge of Venice. This man was somewhere between 85 and 95 years old. He was blind, either completely or nearly so, possibly from a head injury he'd suffered in Constantinople decades earlier during a diplomatic mission. You'd think a blind nonagenarian would be sitting in a palace somewhere being fed grapes. Not Dandolo. This man was about to personally lead a naval assault on the world's most fortified city. Dandolo wasn't interested in Jerusalem. He didn't care about the Holy Land. What he cared about was Venetian profit and power, and he saw in this crusade an opportunity to do 3 things: make Venice obscenely rich, destroy its commercial rivals, and establish Venetian dominance over the entire eastern Mediterranean. The Crusaders thought they were hiring a travel agent. They were actually hiring Machiavelli with boats. By summer 1202, the Venetians had fulfilled their part of the bargain. They'd built a fleet of 50 war galleys and 450 transport ships, enough to carry 3,500 men across the Mediterranean. They'd stockpiled a year's worth of food. They'd recruited thousands of sailors and marines. Venice had essentially militarized its entire economy for this project. The fleet was ready. The bill was due. But then disaster struck. Only about 12,000 Crusaders showed up in Venice. The recruitment had been a catastrophic failure. Some had decided to sail from other ports. Some couldn't afford the journey to Venice. Some had second thoughts. The army that was supposed to be 3,500 was barely a third of that size. The crusade leaders frantically tried to raise the money. Knights pawned their armor. Nobles emptied their treasuries. They borrowed from Italian bankers at crushing interest rates. After squeezing every penny they could find, they'd raised about 50,000 marks. They were still 35,000 marks short, a fortune that simply didn't exist. And here's where Venice's trap snapped shut. The Crusaders were stuck on the Lido, an island in the Venetian lagoon. They had no ships of their own. They couldn't leave without Venetian permission. They were essentially prisoners, surrounded by the Venetian fleet. Venice controlled all food supplies to the island. It was pay up or starve. The situation was becoming desperate. The Crusaders were burning through their supplies. Disease was starting to spread in the camps. Morale was collapsing. The Great Fourth Crusade was dying before it even began, all because of a shipping bill. Then Dandolo made his move. He proposed a solution. Help Venice recapture the city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, and Venice would postpone the debt. Now, Zara was a Christian city under the protection of the King of Hungary, who had also taken crusading vows. Attacking it would be attacking fellow Christians, possibly even fellow Crusaders. Pope Innocent III explicitly forbade it, threatening excommunication for anyone who attacked Zara. But what choice did the Crusaders have? They could accept Dandolo's deal, attack a Christian city, and maybe still reach the Holy Land. Or they could refuse, stay trapped in Venice, and watch their crusade dissolve into nothing. After agonizing debate, they chose Zara. November 1202. The crusading fleet arrived at Zara. Some Crusaders, including Simon de Montfort, were so disgusted they abandoned the crusade rather than attack Christians. The papal legate forbade the assault. But Dandolo didn't care about papal threats. Venice needed Zara's wealth and strategic position. The city was besieged and captured in 2 weeks. The Crusaders and Venetians split the loot, though Venice took the lion's share. When Pope Innocent III heard about Zara, he excommunicated the entire crusading army. Think about that. A crusade, supposedly fighting for God, had been kicked out of the church for attacking Christians. The Fourth Crusade was now spiritually bankrupt, as well as financially bankrupt. But Dandolo wasn't done. While wintering in Zara, a Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos arrived with an incredible offer. His father, Isaac II, had been deposed and blinded by his brother, who now ruled as Alexios III. Young Alexios promised that if the Crusaders helped restore his father to the throne, he would pay them 200,000 marks, enough to pay off Venice and fund the rest of the crusade. He'd also provide 10,000 Byzantine troops for the conquest of Egypt and submit the Greek Orthodox Church to Rome. This was obviously too good to be true. Alexios was promising money he didn't have, troops he couldn't command, and religious submission he had no authority to grant. But Dandolo immediately backed the plan. Why? Because Constantinople was Venice's greatest commercial rival. The Byzantine Empire controlled trade routes Venice wanted. A puppet emperor in Constantinople would mean Venetian dominance of Mediterranean trade. The other crusade leaders were split. Many thought this was insane. They'd taken vows to liberate Jerusalem, not play Byzantine politics. But they were still in debt to Venice. Winter was coming, and they had no alternatives. Dandolo made it clear, Venice's ships would go to Constantinople. The Crusaders could come along or be abandoned in Zara. June 1203. The Crusader fleet arrived at Constantinople, the greatest city in Christendom. Imagine medieval Paris, London, and Rome combined, then multiply by 10. Constantinople had 1 million inhabitants when Paris had 50,000. It had walls that had never been breached in 900 years. It had more gold in its churches than in all of Western Europe combined. The Crusaders expected the city to welcome Alexios as their rightful emperor. Instead, the Byzantines saw Latin barbarians bringing a pretender. No popular uprising materialized. Emperor Alexios III prepared for siege. The Crusaders realized they'd been conned, but they were committed now. The first assault came in July 1203. The Venetians attacked by sea while the Crusaders attacked by land. And here's where 90-year-old blind Dandolo became a legend. He stood in the prow of his galley, the banner of St. Mark in his hands, ordering his ship to be the first to beach. Shamed by an elderly blind man's courage, the Venetians followed. They took a section of sea walls and set fire to the city. Alexios III, seeing the walls breached, fled the city with the treasury. The Byzantines, in desperation, restored blind Isaac II to the throne and accepted his son Alexios IV as co-emperor. The Crusaders had won. Now, it was time to collect. But Alexios IV couldn't pay. The treasury was empty. His uncle had fled with it. He tried desperately to raise money, melting down church ornaments, confiscating noble wealth, taxing everything. The Byzantine population, already hating the Latins, now despised their puppet emperor for robbing them to pay foreign invaders. Meanwhile, the Crusaders camped outside the city, growing increasingly angry as payments failed to materialize. Tensions exploded in January 1204. A Byzantine noble named Mortzuflos led a palace coup, strangling Alexios IV with a bowstring and seizing the throne as Alexios V. He immediately cut off all payments and ordered the Crusaders to leave. But leave to where? They were still in debt to Venice, still had no money, and now had no puppet emperor to pay them. Dandolo and the Crusade leaders made the fateful decision. They would take Constantinople by force and divide the Byzantine Empire among themselves. Venice would get 3/8 of the city and empire, including the best trading quarters and islands. The Crusaders would get the rest. It would be the hostile takeover of an entire empire. The final assault began April 12, 1204. This time, there would be no mercy. The Venetians attacked the sea walls with flying bridges mounted on their ships, essentially mobile assault ramps. 2 ships were lashed together for stability, and knights charged across these bridges directly onto Constantinople's walls. The first man onto the walls was a Venetian. Despite being in his 90s, Dandolo was still directing the assault. Once the Crusaders broke through, Constantinople's defense collapsed. Emperor Alexios IV fled, and then began one of the worst sacks in medieval history. For 3 days, the Crusaders, these soldiers of Christ, ransacked the greatest Christian city on earth. The looting was beyond comprehension. 900 years of accumulated wealth was grabbed in 72 hours. The Crusaders stole everything: gold, silver, silk, spices, holy relics, artworks. They melted down golden altar pieces. They pried gems from gospel covers. They stripped the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, down to its marble. Nicetas Choniades, a Byzantine witness, wrote that Muslim Saracens had been more merciful when they took Jerusalem than these Christian crusaders were to Constantinople. The Venetians, being merchants, were more systematic. They made detailed inventories of what they stole. They carefully packed the most valuable artistic treasures for shipment home. The 4 bronze horses from Constantinople's hippodrome, masterpieces of ancient Greek art, were carefully removed and shipped to Venice. The Palla d'Oro, the golden altarpiece of St. Mark's Basilica, was enriched with Byzantine enamels stolen from Constantinople's churches. But it wasn't just looting. The Crusaders destroyed what they couldn't steal. Libraries were burned. Manuscripts preserving ancient Greek and Roman knowledge were lost forever. Churches were desecrated. Nuns were raped in their convents. The city's population was terrorized. Historians estimate that more Christians were killed by Crusaders in Constantinople than had been killed in all the battles against Muslims in the Holy Land. The Latin Empire of Constantinople was established, with Baldwin of Flanders crowned as emperor in the Hagia Sophia. But it was really Venice that won. They took the best parts of the Byzantine Empire, islands like Crete and Euboea, trading ports around the Aegean, 3/8 of Constantinople itself, including the prime commercial districts. Venice had used the Fourth Crusade to eliminate their greatest commercial rival and establish a trading empire that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. St. Mark's Basilica in Venice is essentially a monument to the Fourth Crusade's loot. The 4 bronze horses stand on its facade, stolen from Constantinople's hippodrome. The Pala d'Oro altarpiece contains Byzantine enamels ripped from Orthodox churches. The treasury of St. Mark's is full of Byzantine chalices, reliquaries, and crowns. Venetians literally built their most sacred building out of stolen Byzantine treasures. The columns in St. Mark's Square came from Constantinople. The porphyry sculptures of the tetrarchs built into the basilica's corner, stolen from Constantinople. Even the marble and decorative elements were stripped from Byzantine churches and shipped to Venice. The entire Sacred Heart of Venice is constructed from the corpse of Constantinople. But here's the real tragedy. The Fourth Crusade didn't just loot Constantinople. It destroyed the Byzantine Empire as an effective state. The empire fragmented into competing Greek successor states. Although the Byzantines eventually recaptured Constantinople in 1261, the empire never recovered. It limped along for another 200 years as a shadow of its former self, before finally falling to the Ottomans in 1453. Think about what this means. The Byzantine Empire had been the shield of Christian Europe for 900 years, holding back Islamic expansion. The Fourth Crusade, meant to fight Islam, instead destroyed Christianity's strongest defender against Islam. When the Ottomans finally conquered Constantinople in 1453, they were conquering a city that the Fourth Crusade had already crippled 250 years earlier. The Pope was horrified when he learned the full extent of what happened. Innocent III wrote, "How indeed will the Church of the Greeks, so afflicted and persecuted, return to ecclesiastical union and devotion to the Apostolic See, when she sees in the Latins only an example of perdition and the works of darkness?" The Fourth Crusade had made the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity permanent. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land. Not a single crusader from this expedition ever fought a Muslim army. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The entire crusade had been hijacked by Venetian commercial interests, turned into a tool for Venice's economic expansion. The blind Doge Dandolo had played everyone, the Pope, the French nobles, the Byzantines, and won everything. Dandolo died in Constantinople in 1205, having lived just long enough to see his plan fully realized. He was buried in the Hagia Sophia, the conqueror resting in the greatest church of the empire he'd destroyed. His tomb was there until 1453 when the Ottomans destroyed it. But his true monument wasn't a tomb. It was the Venetian commercial empire that dominated Mediterranean trade for the next 3 centuries. The Fourth Crusade is the ultimate cautionary tale about debt, dependency, and how economic power can override religious and military power. 30,000 crusaders were turned into mercenaries by a shipping contract. The most powerful military force in Europe was controlled by whoever owned the boats. Venice proved that in medieval warfare, logistics trumped everything, including God. But there's one detail that perfectly captures the insanity of the Fourth Crusade. When the Crusaders were looting Constantinople, they found the crown of thorns, supposedly the actual crown placed on Christ's head during the crucifixion. This holiest of relics was eventually sold to King Louis IX of France to pay Latin Empire debts. The crown that symbolized Christ's suffering became collateral for a loan. That's the Fourth Crusade in a nutshell. Even Christ's crown became a financial instrument. The bronze horses still stand on St. Mark's Basilica today. Napoleon briefly stole them for Paris, but they were returned to Venice after his defeat. They've become so identified with Venice that most tourists don't know they're stolen goods from the greatest sack of a Christian city by a Christian army. They're not just decorations. They're 2,000-year-old Greek masterpieces that traveled from Greece to Rome, to Constantinople to Venice, a journey paid for in blood and betrayal. The economic aftermath of the Fourth Crusade was staggering. Venice's share of the loot has been estimated by historians at around 900,000 silver marks, more than 10 times what the original shipping contract was worth. They didn't just steal gold and silver, They stole entire trade routes. Before 1204, Constantinople controlled the silk trade from China, the spice trade from India, the grain trade from Egypt. After 1204, all of that flowed through Venice. The Venetians set up trading posts in every major Byzantine port they'd taken. They got exclusive trading rights that let them avoid customs duties other merchants had to pay. Within a generation, Venice went from being one of several maritime powers to being the maritime superpower of the Mediterranean. Every piece of Eastern luxury that reached Europe for the next 2 centuries passed through Venetian hands, and they took their cut on everything. The human cost went beyond the immediate massacre. When Constantinople fell, it triggered one of the great brain drains of the medieval world. Byzantine scholars, artists, and craftsmen fled westward, many ending up in Venice and other Italian cities. They brought with them knowledge of Greek language, ancient texts, architectural techniques, and artistic styles. Some historians argue that this refugee crisis from 1204 actually helped plant the seeds of the Italian Renaissance. Venice particularly benefited. Byzantine craftsmen taught them advanced glassmaking techniques that would make Murano glass famous worldwide. Byzantine architects influenced the Gothic style that would dominate Venetian palaces. The very culture Venice had destroyed ended up enriching Venice in ways the looters never imagined. It's darkly ironic. Venice destroyed the Byzantine Empire but inherited its intellectual treasures through the refugees they created. But here's a detail that shows the true depths of Venetian planning. Before the crusade even started, Venice had been minting a new coin, the silver grosso, specifically designed to become the standard currency for Eastern Mediterranean trade once they controlled it. They knew they were going to dominate these markets before the first crusader even showed up. Archaeological evidence shows Venetian merchants had been mapping Byzantine ports and cataloging their defenses for years before 1204. They had detailed intelligence on which Byzantine nobles could be bribed, which cities had weak walls, which trade routes were most profitable. This wasn't opportunistic looting. This was corporate espionage followed by a hostile takeover. The Fourth Crusade was just the military operation that executed a business plan Venice had been developing for decades. The religious consequences rippled for centuries. The sack of Constantinople made any reconciliation between Catholic and Orthodox Christianity impossible. When Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II finally conquered Constantinople in 1453, many Byzantine Greeks actually said they preferred Muslim rule to Latin rule, remembering what the Crusaders had done. The phrase, "better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat," became common. Think about that. Christians so traumatized by other Christians that they preferred Muslim conquest. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans, some Orthodox Christians saw it as divine punishment for the Greeks attempting reconciliation with Rome. The Fourth Crusade didn't just fail to reclaim Jerusalem, it ensured that Christianity would remain permanently divided at the exact moment it needed unity to face Islamic expansion. Venice's greed had fractured Christendom forever, and that's the ultimate irony. Venice, a city built on water and commerce, no knights or castles, defeated the greatest empire in Christendom using nothing but contracts and ships. The Fourth Crusade proved that in the end, whoever controls the transportation controls the war. The Venetians knew this. They built their contract knowing the Crusaders would default. They planned the debt trap from day one. The redirection to Constantinople wasn't an accident. It was the plan all along. The Fourth Crusade teaches us that holy wars can be hijacked by unholy interests, that debt can be more powerful than swords, and that sometimes the greatest threats to civilization come not from external enemies, but from internal greed. Constantinople fell not to Muslim invaders, but to Christian crusaders. The Byzantine Empire was destroyed not by religious enemies, but by business partners. And Venice got away with it all, becoming the richest city in Europe on the gold of fellow Christians. Today, when you visit St. Mark's Basilica, you're not just seeing a church. You're seeing the greatest crime scene in medieval history, decorated with its own evidence. Every Byzantine treasure, every piece of looted marble, every stolen column is a testimony to how Venice turned a holy war into history's greatest heist. The Fourth Crusade didn't just fail to reach Jerusalem, it destroyed the very empire that had protected Christian Europe for a millennium, all for 85,000 marks and a shipping contract.